So hopefully you got as far as this last time when we were talking about over-tourism, which is a new concept. It's one that really started to become apparent about 2018. And over-tourism, too many tourists, is damaging in so many ways, damaging to the environment, to heritage, and also to the local community. But what can we do about it? How can we help this situation? And in order to really understand that, we have to look back a bit at how we actually do tourism, how we see sites. And actually, the way that we experience heritage and culture is something that has historic roots. A lot of what we do today is a kind of tradition that built up. It built up in particular in Europe. It built up at a certain time in Europe. And then it got transported around the world. But the places that we see and the things that we see in those places originally used to be seen in a much more leisurely fashion. Cultural tourism, heritage tourism of the kind of sites that are so iconic today has its origins in the 17th century, in fact, and it was something that used to take a couple of years. It was the elite of Northern Europe and later also the US traveled to Europe and especially to Italy to see the art and to become educated. And they often spent a couple of years doing this. When I say educated, that might give you a sense that what they were doing was really to to improve themselves intellectually. And I suppose definitely there was an element to it. But to be honest, it was also very much about social status. It was about really what would later we would come to call cultural capital. The idea that you, by doing all these different tours, you would actually gain in social status. So a very key part of the tours was really networking with your peers, that is, with other people who were of the same social class as you. And it was really very much about doing that and becoming a member of that class. It also meant that you would take back with you souvenirs and mementos. And this is one of the reasons why so much of the art and antiquity of Europe ended up in Northern Europe, ended up in stately homes and in castles and in palaces, because people wanted to be able to take items back that they could put around their houses that would demonstrate to everybody that they had done what came to be called the Grand Tour. And this became very well developed over a couple of 100 years, and it was limited to a certain elite group. But then in the 19th century, things started to change. And travel became easier and cheaper, and this meant that it was available to many more people. And in particular, the idea of somebody else organizing the tour for you, which actually was done by a company called Thomas Cook. This meant that people who were much further down the social scale could also come to Europe and they could see these places too. And there was a huge appetite for it. But they didn't have the years that people took before to do this travel. And so trips that previously had lasted years were now done in a couple of weeks or months at the most. And this meant that there was a sort of intensification, if you like, of the travel experience. And this is the beginning of what is sometimes called the democratization of culture, meaning that it becomes sort of open to a broader spread of people. But this way of traveling also had a definite colonial aspect to it. Because many of the places that people went to see was part of the overseas empire. And I think it's a company like Thomas Cook wouldn't really have survived if it hadn't been for people going out to the empire. But what it meant was that you could go to the Thomas Cook shop, you could buy everything you needed in the shop. You could get vouchers for hotels and restaurants. And this meant that foreign travel became available to people who hadn't been able to do it before. Because previously, aside from the time and the money that you would have had to travel, you would also have had to have known how to do it. And you would probably have had to have had some language skills as well. But now you could get it all done for you. And once this began to open up to people, this was something that just became more and more and more popular. So throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And it probably would have become very much more popular even earlier than it did, had it not been for the intervention of 2 world wars. It goes in the 19th century, this development of tourism goes along at the same time as nation states really developing their identity. And it very much becomes a part of a national identity. Countries set up national tourist offices, and they try to encourage tourists into their country in order to earn foreign currency. It's also the century in which we really start to get these guidebooks. Nowadays, we look everything up on the internet. But before then, there were companies that gave tourist guides, and these tourist guides became like a kind of Bible for people traveling. They told you exactly the place to go. They told you how to appreciate foreign art. They actually defined it for you and said, this is what you should be looking at, and this is good. And this is better than other things, which you don't need to look at because they're not the important things. And it also started to talk about the people as well. And there comes over in tourist guides of this period a very stereotypical way of describing people who are different from you. And this was what a later social scientist, a man called John Urry, would call the tourist gaze. And by that, he means that when people go on holiday, what they're really looking for is something that is kind of different. And they have a tendency to look at other people as though they're performing a certain role in their life. And tourists want the people in the countries they're visiting to be slightly different and to be what we later came to call exotic. And so they kind of imprint on other people a kind of stereotype. And this can become quite damaging in the sense that it's not always a very positive thing to have such stereotypical views. And in particular, Anglophone guides perpetuated very colonial ideas concerning art and concerning what is valuable in culture. But the beginnings of what we call mass tourism really begin after World War II, because of all the big social changes that took place. First of all, there were a huge number of aircraft that were decommissioned, and indeed pilots. And so the idea comes about to set up charter companies to offer cheap flights. And then people end up having more disposable income as the economy starts to pick up after the war from the 1950s onwards. There's more disposable income and also more leisure time. And there develops tour operators and hotel chains. And low budget airlines begin in the 1970s. So suddenly it's a great deal easier to go on holiday, and many, many more people begin to do so. And I took this photograph, which is from, this was in Greece, taken in Greece, because I thought it was a sort of visual idea of what this tourist gaze is, in that these tourists are just sort of fascinated by this lady because she looks so different. And they're quite imposing, really, on her. And the visa restrictions begin to be eased, and there's just a lot more people traveling. And so these are like key points in the development of tourism. We get the beginning of the Grand Tour, which defines certain places as being the important places to go to. And they pick out the kind of works of art you should see. And then in the 19th century, we get the beginning of this opening up so that people other than the elite can travel. And then post-World War II, we get rebuilding, and we get mass tourism starts. And then we get two very important events that I'm going to bring in now, which is the 1972 UNESCO Convention and the beginning of the World Heritage List. And then from the 1990s onwards, the development of a global tourism linked to the internet, what's sometimes called the internetization of tourism. And those are really the events that lead us up to the situation of over-tourism that we've seen recently. So the 1972 UNESCO Convention was for the protection of world cultural and natural heritage. And it led 3 years later to the beginning of the World Heritage List. Now, originally, the idea of the convention is to focus on protection because it was recognized that cultural and natural heritage are increasingly threatened with destruction, and that this would be a great damage to the heritage of the world, and that it was often quite difficult to protect heritage at the national level because of the scale of the resources. The World Heritage List began in 1975. This is a picture of one of the first sites to be inscribed, which is the Galapagos Islands, which we're going to come back to in a moment. But as the list extended, the potential economic impact of the branding of World Heritage on the sites listed starts to become very evident. It's clear that people are attracted to the site because they have they are nominated as being on the World Heritage List. And the idea of putting sites on the list seems to morph really from being for protection towards something that can be a very good economic benefit, which was not the original intention of the list. It was actually mentioned, but it wasn't initially what it was for. But over time, it's become very much a part of this. But even as the World Heritage List was starting, there were signs that tourist sites were struggling to cope with the number of tourists. And I have here, this is a report from 1980-81 of the World Tourism Organization, UNWTO, and it starts to talk for the first time of the saturation of tourist destinations. And so it's warning that, in fact, actually, these sites have got as many tourists as they can deal with. And if we go on to the second page, go down to the third paragraph, it says it should be noted that saturation and carrying capacity was the subjects of a special examination, and efforts to be intensified to avoid the overloading of tourist facilities. So even at this early stage, this is being something of a problem. But it's a problem that starts to get much more intense when we get the internet coming into tourism booking. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, of course, is a great increase in the number of sites and number of visitors that people that go and book. And secondly, it's the fact that it becomes very much a person-to-person trade. So in actual fact, the big sort of national organizations and organizations through chains and package tours and charter flights, well, that starts to become of less importance. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to control and actually to predict. Such that in 2009, the World Heritage Centre decides to take an entirely new approach to this. And it decides to conclude the World Heritage Tourism Programme, to actually finish what they've got, and to begin a new programme on World Heritage and sustainable tourism. And so to actually reboot all their ideas on this in order to try and control the numbers. And indeed, if you go to the site, you can see, and I recommend that you do, you go to UNESCO and look at the sustainable tourism site. You will see that there are all kinds of, it's got all kinds of tools there that can be used. In fact, it's got a lot of really very useful publications that are very practical, handbooks to give you advice on how to develop a sustainable program, instruments to measure sustainability with. It's a very, they've got a lot of material there, which is very, very useful. But the problem is that the problem with trying to deal with this is really the overall trends that are so overwhelming. What there is here is, this is international arrivals. And you can see that it's just going up kind of exponentially from 1995 to 2019. Obviously, 2020, there's a crash, but we'll have to wait to see. All the indications are that it's going to very quickly come back up onto the trend. And indeed, if we look at the figures here at 2008, when there was the global economic downturn, you can see that it didn't take very long before it was back on the same trend. And just to bear in mind that domestic tourism is estimated to be 6 times the size of international tourism. So that's a pretty, that's often not in the figures. And according to UNWTO, tourism is the world's third largest export category after fuels and chemicals. And so that makes it a very, very big economic factor. And it's going to be very difficult to control that. Travel is really dominated by tourism. And it can be a little bit surprising to discover that business, in fact, only is 11% of the total quantity of travel. The overwhelming majority is leisure, which is 55%. And then there's another 28%, which is visiting friends and relatives and for other reasons such as health. It's not that business itself is really driving international travel. It's actually tourism that is. I'm going to skip over this because we had very pleased to welcome Fergus, who we're going to go to in a moment. I'm afraid we had a few connection difficulties, Fergus, so we're running a little bit behind, but you're on mute at the moment.
No problem. I'm happy to be here, Valerie. Thank you for the kind invitation. Still
on mute, but we'll come back to you.
Okay.
We'll come back to you in a second.
Okay.
So moving on, what is the impact of this tourism on World Heritage? Well, it's obviously, in particular, we worry about natural World Heritage, which is very, very fragile. And go back to where we started, Galapagos, because it seemed like a sort of a good place to go back to, because that was the first inscribed as the World Heritage. And it's really is suffering a lot, even though they try to control heritage. There is a lot of damage being caused. How can that be? It was the first site that was on the list. It should be possible to control it. But if you just take a look at the number of tourists visiting the Galapagos Islands, well, you can see where the problem comes immediately. Okay, it's my sound that's turned off, Fergus. I'm very sorry.
Oh, no problem. No yes. problem at all. No problem.
I'll try and deal with that in a moment. I don't quite know why it would be, but anyway. So if we look as well at how we might deal with this in something like the Galapagos Islands, I put this here for you to look at yourself. It's on open access. And one of the suggestions, and it's one that really, I think, comes up so often in talking about World Heritage, is that you really need to engage local stakeholders. And you need to address community concerns, especially regarding basic services. You need to also try and get some balance between high-end tourism and informal tourism, because even if you restrict tourism just by like increasing the price or making it into something that's very elite, well, that's, you know, rather fundamentally unfair. And as we can see, has been going against the whole so-called democratization of tourism, which is to open it up and to have more people coming in. So we need to try and control it, but you don't want to control it in such a way that the only people who can visit are people who have a lot of money. You want to try and find a way that's better than that. And of course, it's not just natural sites, because in particular, historical cities have suffered a lot. These were the original cultural heritage tourist sites, and they are still the ones that people want to see today. Italy in particular, of course, suffers from this, but one of the problems is that as new sites enter up and as new World Heritage sites come on board, in particular in Asia, for example, then we find that the same models are being applied there that were applied in Europe, and having the same issues of people crowding into a very kind of small number of sites that are the ones that tend to be the famous ones, and people want to see the same monuments within those sites. It causes a lot of problems for the environment, for the monuments, and also for the local population. So let's just have a quick look at what happens when you get too many people there. So this is just 1 year's worth of damage at Petra, which is caused, I mean, sometimes it's caused by vandalism, but more often just by people being a little bit careless. Here, for example, you know, people walking over this altar causes all the stones to be distributed. Anything to do with wall paintings, so for example, painted tombs or anything like that, there's a limited number of people who can go and see this, because people going in, they have to breathe, and breathing brings about moisture, which destroys wall paintings. Vandalism increases with too many people in an area. People get less, they care a bit less for it when you have a lot of people there. And of course, we also come to the impact on the local community. There is often a kind of assumption that if there's a lot of people visiting a place, that actually translates into a good economy for the local people. But in actual fact, regretfully, that often doesn't happen. Instead, what often happens is that the money has a tendency to go to companies and organizers who are not necessarily local. And the impact on the local community actually can be quite negative. Let's take as an example, we're going to take Prague as an example here, but there are lots of cities that are like this. Rome is in fact like this, where you have the historic city, and then can you see up on the hill, you have the modern city, and that's where most of the people, the residents of Prague, live. Because one of the impacts on historic cities is what is called gentrification. And that is the historic city itself becomes almost unlivable for ordinary people. It gets taken over by tourism. It gets the buildings there and the hotels begin to replace residences. Certainly in the center of Rome these days, you have 3 or even 4 visitors for every person who is a resident in the center of Rome. And that means you start to lose facilities at a certain point, because it becomes more advantageous to have retail space that is for visitors rather than for the kinds of services that residents need. So it becomes an uncomfortable place to live. And this what is sometimes called a donut arrangement, whereby you have the historic centre and then often a bit of a gap, and then you have a sort of the the most of the people who are residents there living on the outskirts. And in the videos that I put for the preparation for this presentation tonight, there was, I think, quite a moving account of the people in Venice who are having to move out, essentially. It's just too expensive to live in Venice. So they move over to the mainland, to Marghera, which is in fact an oil terminal. I mean, it couldn't really be more different than living in Venice. And, they even in the end quite like it because it's really so difficult to live in Venice. My colleague, Barbara Stanisha, who works at La Sapienza in Rome, she did this research on the population in Rome. What you need to know is that the blue part is areas that are being depopulated by residents, and the orangey bits are areas that are acquiring residents. So you can see that the centre of Rome is getting progressively depopulated. And we get a process known as touristification, which is local shops and services get replaced by services for tourists. And the kind of materials being sold are materials that could be anywhere. They're not local, they're not typical of the area, they're just mass-produced tourist items that could be for anywhere. The traffic gets dominated by tourist buses. So is there any hope here? How can we make tourism in historic cities more sustainable? Well, of course, one of the simplest ways is to try and introduce regulations to control tourists. So you probably saw this is quite recent. The Louvre is going to significantly limit the number of people coming to see the art. That's definitely quite a big change. I wonder how they're going to deal with that, because of course, the costs of museums go up every year. It's not like you can just suddenly decide to take a cut in revenue. You're going to have to try and build it up in some way, to replace that. And this is Venice's approach to even restrict the number of tourists in the city. Maybe we haven't got the sound for that. I might skip on, but the idea in Venice is actually to have tickets for you would book to visit Venice, essentially. And you would not necessarily just be able to turn up and visit, which is quite a radical departure. And I'll just some cities have limited Airbnb. Airbnb, which in itself is, not at all a bad idea. The idea that you could rent out your spare room and make a bit of extra money. The problem is it has kind of taken over some city centres. And so, and they've really found themselves losing out, because certainly it's also happened in Rome that entire apartment blocks have ended up being given over to Airbnb. So at that point, it becomes effectively an unlicensed hotel. And that is very problematical, because as such, they're not paying sort of local taxes that hotels pay. And but of course, they are using the public facilities, they're using the roads, creating the traffic and the trash. So that can be very problematical. Or can we be even a bit more radical and break the mold of mass tourism? This is another suggestion, that really just putting regulations on it that perhaps is not going to work. And so we need to turn tourists into travelers. Can we do that? Let's have a look. Well, this is a UNESCO idea, to have heritage journeys and to combine, to make it much more in-depth, as they say, to travel differently and travel deeper. So to combine a trip that's got built heritage with intangible cultural heritage expressed through different living cultural values. So to bring in a previous presentation, we spoke a lot about intangible cultural heritage and about if you could actually take away that tourist gaze that we spoke of before, and instead of sort of looking for a pastiche, look for a real experience. And we know that is what people like to have these days, and a real kind of meeting of minds, which is not just about seeing some iconic structure, but also about seeing other structures and about other, also communicating with people. And one suggestion is that each tourist site develop its own spirit of place. So get away from the idea of mass tourism, get away from the idea of touristification of a sort of very bland international approach to tourism. Encourage a more unique experience where tourists stay longer. And that's very important. Having fewer tourists staying longer is much more sustainable because people go and see different sites and they essentially spend more money. In Rome, for example, the average length of stay is less than 3 days. And so that means that tourists they're all focused on the same points. They go to see the Forum, the Colosseum, St. Peter's. That's about it, really, maybe the Pantheon, but they don't really get to know the city or the people. So the spirit of place, which is an ICOMOS idea, ICOMOS is the UNESCO agency that looks after monuments. And spirit of place is defined as being tangible and the intangible. So to give a much kind of richer experience. So can we reinvent cultural tourism? That's really our challenge. I'm going to come out of screen share. I'm going to, must apologize for all of the problems that we've had with our connection. Now, the problem is I'm not sure I can hear you. What I'd like to introduce, first of all, Fergus. Fergus is a great expert in heritage. I first met him at a conference, a UNESCO conference, and he's been advising UNESCO and ICOMOS and UNWTO. So he has a great experience. And I've asked him to think about, in particular, to talk about how he sees tourism post-COVID. But I do have a slight problem in that I think I'm not going to be able to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No, I can't. Okay. No. So, but I gather everybody else can. So what I'm going to suggest, Fergus, because Harry tells me everyone else can hear you, but I can't hear you. So what I'm going to suggest, Fergus, is if I could ask you to talk for just a few minutes to the group on how you see tourism, and in particular in the post-COVID world, how we're going to respond. And we have with us Kirsty and Melissa. Kirsty and Melissa look at all the questions and ask and like summarize them. So if I can ask Melissa also to take over a bit and help you with the questions. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out and log in again and hope that I will be joining you in a few minutes and I will be able to hear you. Okay? So I'm handing over to you, Fergus, at this moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you again for the kind invitation to be here. I am based in Canada, just near our capital, Ottawa. And as Valerie mentioned, I've been working in the tourism field for about the past 30 years. The organization that I am involved with, that she mentioned, is the International Council of Monuments and Sites. And we are one of 3 advisory bodies to UNESCO's World Heritage Center. The other 2 are the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that deals with cultural heritage, natural sites, heritage sites, that is based in Lausanne, and ICROM, which is a training body for various cultural heritage matters, many of them related to UNESCO, that is based in Rome. So it's not too far away from where Valerie is. So, good point into many points that Valerie raised, and thank you for many of the comments that I saw as well during her discussion. I've seen the evolution of tourism over those 30 years that I mentioned, and particularly when you look at places in Europe, you think of Venice, you think of Florence, you think of Barcelona, Dubrovnik, Amsterdam, Prague, many famous cultural heritage sites and destinations have certainly had their challenges, to the point that in, I believe it was about 2015, the editor of Skift, which is an online publication, coined the term, his name is Rafa Ali, coined the term over-tourism. And certainly was predicated on the fact that many of these destinations, and as I'd seen in the comments that had been raised during Valerie's presentation, they're suffering, and certainly suffering from too many people, too much demand on local resources, too many impacts on local environments, and also the livability questions of the people who are there. Because certainly it's one thing to be a resident of a place, but where do you send your children to school? How do you have your own recreation? Where do you shop for groceries or for food? Where do you get the day-to-day things that you normally have as a resident of a place? And I think that, a couple of things immediately come to mind, particularly as, someone who lives near a World Heritage Site as I do, here in Ottawa with the Rideau Canal. And I've seen some of the impacts of it, but it's certainly not as great as a European city. And just, a few things for you to think about in that. It's becoming evident that a number of these places, whether it's Venice, for example, which I think is for the first time really this year, gone below 50% residency or ownership of land within the city. So again, you're seeing that depopulation to places like Marghera or Padua or other places. And this is happening in other cities as well. You're seeing significant demands on local infrastructure because all those people are placing demands on roads, electricity, water, services, etc., that also local residents depend upon. And also expectations, just to finally add that last point, in the sense that, coming to many of these places, just like when you go to the Louvre, you have an expectation to see the Mona Lisa, or if you go to Florence, you have the expectation to see Michelangelo's David at the Uffizi. We've created all these expectations as part of that tourism intention. The fact that we've made it easier and more accessible, particularly with discount air carriers and lower prices and various sort of other aspects to access these places, has just exacerbated or accelerated the process. And the question is, is the horse too much out of the barn? Has it just left? Or is there a way to dial back and perhaps start to retrench and rethink the tourism model moving forward? So I think I'll stop there and open up questions or discussion with Valerie as well.
Great, I can hear you now. Harry,
Great.
is it possible to, because I'm having a bit of problem with the video, is it possible to take off the back, the filter? That doesn't
I'm
matter.
just trying to do that. I'm just trying to do that for you now, Val. Give me a couple of minutes. Keep talking.
Okay, I didn't actually, I didn't hear you. I've now got it sorted out, Fergus, but I'm curious to know, I'm sure I apologize to everyone if you're going to say something. I mean, do you feel that post-COVID, we're getting back to the same trend that we were on before?
To a certain degree, in the sense that, there's two things where on one side of it, I've traveled a fair bit over the past 6 months, and I have more travel coming up. I'm leaving for West Africa on Saturday, but I've traveled a fair bit, and of all the flights that I've taken, I've barely seen an empty seat coming from North America to Europe or to Africa or elsewhere. And so you're starting to see a ramp up of numbers of people who are visiting. Equally, though, at the same time, you're also having destinations like Barcelona or Dubrovnik or Venice or Amsterdam start to say, look, we've had enough and we really need to rethink in terms of what our tourism model is. Amsterdam, when it comes to tourism behavior, Venice on the admissions ticketing processes there, Dubrovnik with the cruise ship limitations, and of course, Barcelona with the Airbnb limitations. So again, that intentionality is there in place.
Right. So Melissa, what are I've seen that there's been lots of work in the chat.
Yes.
So tell us, what are some of the questions?
Well, we have a lot of questions about kind of like where you see the role of tourist guides and people and actually making tourism sustainable and turning to tourists as responsible travelers. There's also some talk about specific sites like Machu Picchu and kind of updates on their situation with monitoring tourism, as well as back on ideas, questions around outlining spirit of place and how, like, if you would want to educate and guide a tourist on that and a tourism board, what would you do?
Right. I can say one thing that I've noticed, because we work a fair bit with the Colosseum. They give our students internships and things, which is very nice of them to do that. And they used to have quite, they used to not like guides and particularly unlicensed guides. They didn't.
I think Val is frozen again.
Increases the number of people who can go through. So I think that was an interesting shift, I would say. It is one way of dealing with this. But what are your thoughts on this, Fergus?
So thank you, Valerie, for the question. So I'm in full agreement that, let's just step back a little bit, maybe just to say, a lot of what tourism is based on expectations. And so that's that expectation of a visitor coming to a place and what she or he is coming to see, what their interest is, and the level of behavior, or way of interacting with locals and seeing the different venues and enjoying the various elements of tangible and intangible cultural heritage or natural heritage or other aspects that they've gone there for in the first place. I think that, it's having guides is certainly very useful and very helpful because of the fact that in some ways people are just looking at things and not fully comprehending or understanding why or how that place is necessarily there. And some of the interesting stories that really bind one more to a place and really give it a greater sense of why that place is there and how they can appreciate it more. And maybe, serendipitously, the guide might say, look, while you're here, go look at that site or go look at that museum. My daughter was just in London with friends before heading back to uni. And my brother said, what you need to do is you need to go to this domestic garden within the city, and you also need to see this museum of the home. I would have never been able to recommend that because I don't live in London. I don't have those experiences. But again, by that interaction, you're able to get a different flavor, a different sense of that place. And this is where I think this is what you're trying to convey, as opposed to you have to go see the Mona Lisa in Paris, or you have to go see the David and the Uffizi, or you have to go see the Colosseum. These communities, these places are so much more. And this is a way to spread the economic benefits, but also to gain a greater sense and understanding of that place, because otherwise you're just in that lineup with everyone else, just basically seeing the thing that everyone else sees, and all you're doing at the end afterwards is saying, I've seen the Mona Lisa, or I've seen the Venetian canals, but not necessarily getting a full representative understanding of that place.
Yes, yes. One of the questions in the chat is about Bhutan. I don't know if I have never been to Bhutan, but my understanding is that it is very limited, the number of people who can go.
Yes.
And it, as I understand it, is actually very expensive as well.
Yes, it is. It is. I've been to Sikkim a couple of times, and Sikkim is right beside Bhutan in northeastern India, and certainly I've had a number of friends who worked in Thimphu and in Bhutan as well. And certainly, at the time, you had to spend a minimum, I think, of $220 US per day. There is a limitation for the time that you could spend there, and you also had to engage a local guide as well. And the Bhutanese government had placed limitations on it. So, but in Bhutan is $300 US per day now, so it's gone up in terms of the price. Good to see. But the intention is to control, say, the number of people who are there, but also I think to try and diffuse in some way the impacts on the local culture, because I know that the Bhutanese are very proud of their culture, and they have this concept of gross national happiness, amongst other things that are part of their society, and they're wary about that considerable outside influence upon their country, if they were to open up the gates to visitors.
Yes, yes. We've got in the chat someone pointing out that it's been sort of even more tourism in Greece, and I think that's certainly seems to be the case also in some places in Italy. I remember Barbara Stanisha and I, who's my colleague who teaches tourism at La Sapienza, we were having a discussion during COVID about what would happen post-COVID and how this might be a possibility to change tourism, because Rome really was suffering a lot, I would say. It really has suffered. But she said that she didn't have much hope for it, because she felt that all she sees is the tourist industry lobbying, in fact, to be allowed to do even more because they want to make up the money that they've lost.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge right now, is that many of these places have long-term investments, and particularly if you're in a tourist hub or tourist center, you pay huge rents, or there are huge costs that you have to pay on a day-to-day basis. And many places, one of the reasons, many is tourism businesses, tourism operators, the reasons why they've gone under or had to reduce service considerably is the fact that there's so much excess cost. And then on top of that, inputs like fuel, of course, in Europe have gone up. Other costs, labor costs have gone up, and even trying to find labor or staff is difficult. So the industry post-COVID, and particularly with the conflict in Ukraine, is facing a number of challenges in Europe as it is in other parts of the world.
Yes, yes. How do you feel about the programs like Spirit of Place and the Heritage? Do you think they work? Do you think
I think they can, in the sense that here in Canada, I work with a number of Indigenous groups on Indigenous-based tourism, and a lot of that is Spirit of Place related, particularly the World Heritage sites. Right now, I'm not sure how many of your audience are familiar with the World Heritage process, but We have something called, of course, the World Heritage List, but the tentative list of those sites that have been considered potential candidates to be presented to the World Heritage Committee for a nomination. Canada currently has, I believe, 14 sites on our tentative list, and I'd argue that about 12 to 13 of those are Indigenous based. In a sense, the focus is that they're trying to really focus more on the different aspects of Indigenous culture and the unique spirit of that place. And in fact, there was one of the sites is in central Canada named Pimachuanaki. And what they tried to argue at that time was that nature and culture are interactive. It's not just the monuments, but it's how culture informs nature and vice versa. This was something that UNESCO had to wrap their heads around, but finally in 2018, Pimachuanaki realized this nomination because of the fact that there was an understanding eventually on the importance of the spirit of that place and how visitors could appreciate it and better understand it because of the way it had been constructed or formulated.
Yeah, I think in many ways the division between culture and nature that dates right back to the beginning of UNESCO. I think it is something that has become a rather negative thing. If we had it more integrated, I think it would be easier.
It is. Well, they have something called the nature culture or culture nature journey that has been inculcated between IUCN and ECOMOS as a shared practice, because I think what had happened was that in some cases, particularly UNESCO has something called mixed World Heritage Sites, which covers both heritage and cultural heritage and natural heritage of a site. One of the things that was really starting to cause some problems was that you have regular reporting and regular understanding of these sites, and the cultural heritage reporting was contradicting or contravening what was being said on the natural heritage reporting. And they just said, you have to work together as these groups and organizations to help support the improved management from a joint approach from the culture nature elements.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is that the two halves are so separate. I mean, they're in separate places. People have different training. It's really quite hard to come together.
It is. And, and there's one other thing, just as you were discussing, I was thinking about it as well, is the fact that, we're talking about things now like regenerative tourism or sustainable tourism, and a lot of that is focused on the community. And there's an understanding that as a destination, there's going to be participation, involvement, and you're part of what we call in the industry the visitor economy, where you are the transportation, you're the services, you're the restaurants, you're the hotels, you're the all the different elements that feed into the supply chain to support and hopefully benefit from the tourism industry in that community. The challenge is that not all destinations are created equally. There is an outflow or outside the community ownership, as you mentioned during your presentation, and also the fact that tourist expectations are changing. The way you and I used to tour when we were younger is very different than it is 30, 40 years later, because of the fact that the opportunities are there, the intentions are there, and the expectations are there that are all different and have changed.
Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I've noticed when, because every year I teach a class on heritage tourism, and I always really start by asking students to analyze their own experience, their own kind of, what's worked for them, what was the biggest disappointment you had, what was the best experience you had. And actually that word experience keeps coming in because I think, particularly if you look at this in a sort of long-term historical context, people in the past, they wanted to go and see, but I think in particular younger people today want to experience, they want some emotion from it, I think.
Right. But, an experience can be many things. It can be, meeting locals. It can be a day doing some sort of craft or traditional activity. It can be an event or a celebration. And so again, there's just, the world has expanded in so many different ways in terms of interests and some of the different things that you can do and share within your community or city or destinations, that there really is so much more. And how do you open up your community, and do you want to open up your community?
Yeah.
That's a challenge. I mean, there's my favorite World Heritage Site in the world in terms of its name is Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, and that's in it's one of the 1,153 current sites, but it's in Western Canada. And if you have a chance, go and visit it. But the unique thing is that it's a beautiful location, and it's built into the side, and in essence what it was the local indigenous people use it as a kill site for buffalo, which they would survive and live off of during their history. And so it's a very unique representation of it. But what I do know is that at that site, they've placed very significant controls or barriers, because of the fact they don't want non-native or people who are not band members to visit places where they have sacred ceremonies, or they have sacred territory or landscapes that they have definitively said to the site manager, look, you can have this site here, you can have the interpretive center, we're happy to have you employ locals and benefit from it, but you cannot go beyond this barrier, because this is our culture at this point, and we will not allow or brook any kind of development taking place there.
Right. We have a very interesting question from Laurie, who says, how do we feel about voluntourism, where people travel and volunteer?
Yeah, it's there's been some very interesting writing on it over the past 5-10 years. There's a lady called Pippa Biddle who wrote a very interesting article. I can't remember the publication. It might have been the New York Times or another newspaper or magazine, but it was just interesting in terms of what are the benefits being accrued by actual local residents and communities, and what is the work that's actually being done there to support that. In some cases, I do have questions because of the way that the program is designed and the way that it's actually meeting a local need that isn't being addressed locally, because sometimes when volunteers come in at teaching is a good example of that, they can transplant the opportunity or work of local teachers to do certain work. On the flip side, you have some volunteerism groups that support emergency recovery, Habitat for Humanity, for example, or others who come in and work with local groups to support the construction of local architecture, housing, and others from disaster recovery, for example. And there are others that in Canada, we have something called CESO, which is Canadian Executive Services Overseas. And for accommodation and a flight, you get an expert who has 30-40 years of experience and can come in and support local initiatives, but not charge an arm and a leg like international consultants or multilaterals might. So again, it's there's a really broad base of volunteerism type operations there, but I think especially for communities that are considering it, you have to really say, is it just bringing people here so that they'll spend money, or is it also bringing people here so they'll make a difference and improve the lives and well-being of the people who live there?
Yeah, I certainly also heard of some reports that weren't entirely positive about the impact for the local community. So yeah. Okay, well, we've got a bit late this with this presentation. We've had a lot of connecting problems, but so thank you, Fergus, for staying on. Thank you all, everyone, for your patience. I lost the connection 4 times before we got going.
Okay. Well, I thank you for the kind invitation, for being here. And as you know, I publish a lot on tourism facets or articles, and audience members are welcome to connect to me on LinkedIn if they like. I talk often on different tourism aspects, so you're most welcome.
Yes, and because most people here join through LinkedIn, so you can contact Fergus through LinkedIn. Apologies again, everyone. And also for the rather ghostly image that you've had to deal with. We actually tried to take the filter off, but we couldn't manage it. So yeah, I'm a spectral force here at the moment. So yeah, it's not the cat filter. No, it could have been worse, couldn't it? Yes, that's right.
AI, I think it's AI GTP or chat GTP. Yeah.
Well, when it goes wrong, you know, this modern technology, when it goes wrong, it just leaves you with egg on your face. So what can you do? And thank you to my colleagues who came up and helped with this. Thank you, Harry, in particular, who worked to get us back online. And so everybody else on the course will be back next week. We're going to, next week is our last week. And we're going to be looking at development, and we're going to come back to tourism and looking at development as well a little bit, and peace building. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Fergus. Sorry about the delay.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye. Bye.